The French writer Victor Hugo once said, "Breathe in Paris, it nourishes the soul." But we all know that Paris and the rest of France have become a bit of a war zone, or like a GTA lobby recently, and this is the case every few years. So we're going to start this video when France first became an unpleasant place to be. Introducing the region that we call France today. And in its prehistory, like everywhere else in Europe, it was occupied by nomadic and tribal groups. The ones that lived here belonged to the Indo-European group, the Celts, and referred to themselves as gauls. Belgae were to the north, the Aquitani to the south, and over the first millennium BC, Carthaginian, Roman and Greek colonies existed along the Mediterranean coast, Marseille being the first city to be established in 600 BC. The Gauls had a rich warrior culture, and gold mines found all over Gaul indicated that they were very wealthy. They imported wine from the Mediterranean and were amazing metalsmiths, and a notable tribe called the Parisii, who found a city on the Seine River in modern-day Paris. In 387 BC, the Gauls sacked the young city of Rome, destroying all records of the city's history before that point, and earning themselves a reputation as the bogeymen to the north of the fledgling republic. And after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, a group of Germanic tribes called the Franks invaded Gaul, and over the years rival Frankish kingdoms squabbled until they were united by Clovis of the Merovingian dynasty into a Frankish empire. And with these early kingdoms it will be a trend that the title of king is little more than that, a title which didn't hold much power, and they were merely puppets placed there for religious and traditional reasons. Christianity was also adopted, and Charles Martel defeated the Muslim invasion at the Battle of Tours, securing France as one of the centres of Christendom. The kingdoms continued to be divided up between his sons upon the death of the king. When King Pepin became king of the Franks in 751, he established the famous Carolingian dynasty, as well as more power for the king himself. But his dynasty's most famous member is Charlemagne, who became king of the Franks in 768. Sharing power with his brother Carloman until his death in 771, Charles forced Carloman's sons out and took sole control of the Frankish kingdom, carving himself out an empire through military conquest of Western Europe.
Your half! There is no your half of the money! There is only my all of it, do you understand?
Charlemagne laid the foundations for feudalism by appointing counts to manage his lands, and would go on to be crowned Western Europe's first emperor since the fall of Rome by the Pope himself. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun divided Carolingian possessions into 3 kingdoms, and West Francia is the one we're going to follow. Soon after this, Vikings invaded northern France. Ragnar Lothbrok sacked Paris. The Vikings would go on to settle in the north, becoming the Normans. 150 years later, in 987, Hugh Capet was elected king of West Francia, forming the Kingdom of France under the control of the Capetian dynasty, an extremely feudal state with low crown authority that was effectively had autonomous vassals. The French also participated in the Crusades of the Holy Land during this time, which were initially successful and later less so. And with the Norman conquest in 1066, William the Conqueror found himself Duke of Normandy as well as King of England. His successors would continue to claim lands in France. There would be the issue as to whether these lands were still subject to the French king. This effectively set up the long rivalry between the two powers, as well as the 100 Years' War itself, with the original Anglo-Norman kings controlling Normandy, and later the Angevin kings from Anjou controlling even more of it. Philip II, known as Augustus, largely pushed the Angevin kings out of France following the Battle of Bovine in 1214. And by the end of his reign, France was the most powerful state in Europe. It gave birth to the incredible Gothic style, beautiful cathedrals being constructed which make anything we build in the modern day look like hot garbage. And I do have a much more in-depth video on the 100 Years' War, but I'd say it's probably not very good. And it does mainly focus on the English perspective because this is nothing but a patriotic YouTube channel. But to summarise, Edward III, King of England, and Philip of Valois, the house now in control of France, both claim the French throne.
You think you're the king? I'm the king!
And to be fair, Edward was the rightful king of France. But anyway, so began the 100 Years' War. The English got off to a good start in the war, utilising their longbows to win the battles of Crécy and Poitiers against all odds, where they even captured the French king. English armies rampaged around France and the peasants just had a terrible time of it, especially since the French countryside was being ravaged by the Black Death during all of this, which killed peasant and noble alike. But a truce was signed with England in 1360, and Edward III renounced his claim on the French throne in exchange for substantial lands in France. And Charles the Mad became King of France, but the country was ruled by regents since the poor bloke believed he was made of glass. And during this time a civil war was fought between the houses of Burgundy and Orleans. And when hostilities with England continued, Henry V annihilated the French nobility at the Battle of Agincourt and made himself heir to the French throne. But when Charles the Mad and Henry both died in 1422, Henry's son, Henry VI of England, was also crowned King of France in Paris, the only person ever to be both. And meanwhile, Charles VI's son was crowned Charles VII in Reims. And war commenced between the two factions, and the morale of Charles's faction was greatly boosted by the appearance of 16-year-old Joan of Arc, and claiming to have been instructed by God himself to do so. Joan helped Charles's faction to drive the English out of Orleans and later France itself, despite being captured and executed herself in the process. France won the 100 Years' War with the surrender of Bordeaux in 1453, and Joan of Arc is remembered as the nation's patron saint. French nationalism was strengthened, as was the power of the French king. A rivalry with the Austrian House of Habsburg continued for the rest of the century, as the Habsburgs consolidated their control over vast swathes of the Holy Roman Empire and the rest of Europe. The French and the Habsburgs would fight numerous times, notably in the Italian Wars, and the rivalry would last for centuries, especially when Charles V's territory completely surrounded France. And in the 16th century, the Renaissance was a golden age of art and culture there. The language was standardised, and French explorers began to explore the New World, establishing colonies in Canada, the Caribbean and India. But with the Protestant Reformation in Europe, a lot of countries left the Catholic Church, and this left France with Protestant minorities known as Huguenots. The tensions rose between them and the Catholics, culminating in the Wars of Religion in 1562, in which some 3 million died. Protestants were prosecuted and massacred as the years went on, until Henry of Navarre was crowned King of France, and he converted to Catholicism in order to end the fighting, and he granted some rights to the Huguenots in their Edict of Nantes. Religious tensions remained high during these years, and colonisation of the New World continued. Over in the Holy Roman Empire, similar things were occurring, and the religious wars there escalated into a continent-wide power struggle, which I'm not even going to begin to try and explain. France decided to put its religious gripes aside and side with the Protestant nations in order to fight off their rivals, the Habsburgs. And the 30 Years' War was just cataclysmic for Europe. 8 million people died. But it is in that perfect spot of history where you get knights riding horses with guns, so it is one of the cool ones. But it ended inconclusively with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This gained France some territory, and the trend of greater religious freedom across Europe followed. And it's cited in the field of international relations as the birth of the concept of the modern nation-state, as well as that of the balance of power in Europe, which became a major roadblock to future warlords. King Louis XIV was crowned at 4 years old and is the longest ruling monarch in European history, with a 72-year-long reign. In his youth there was a revolution against his regents, and Louis XIV would observe this and then go on to rule with an iron fist. He used his absolute crown authority to impose his Catholicism upon the entire country, causing 400,000 Huguenots to flee abroad. And during his reign, Louis XIV established what is effectively the modern French borders during a series of wars against pretty much the whole of Europe. He also lived it up lavishly in the Palace of Versailles. And with the death of Charles II of Spain, and him leaving the Spanish throne to the grandson of Louis, Philip of Anjou, this greatly upset the balance of power. The coalition fought the French to prevent this in the War of Spanish Succession. The war ended inconclusively, and Philip was allowed to inherit the Spanish throne, provided he gave up his claims to the French. And 13 years of fighting probably could have been prevented if they'd fought this earlier. But Louis XIV had brought France to unprecedented heights of power, expanding territories in the Americas, Africa and Asia, before he died at 76, and was succeeded by his great-grandson, who was known as, you probably guessed it, Louis XV, and the non-stop war continued during his reign, alongside a golden age of philosophy known as the Enlightenment. But to summarise, there were coalition wars in Spain, Poland and Austria, as well as the first truly global conflict, the 7 Years' War. France ceded most of its colonies to Britain and Spain in the Treaty of Paris during this, but as revenge, France would go on to help the Americans during their revolution, at great cost to itself just despite the British. When the beloved Louis XV was succeeded by, you guessed it again, Louis XVI in 1774, France was left in a bad economic position by the end of the 18th century, and the radical Enlightenment ideas of reason, the rights of man, combined with the suffering of the lower classes, who had been taxed and starved to fund all these wars to create the perfect storm that would topple what was known as the Ancien Regime, the Old Order. The Ancien Regime was as old as France, and existed to make sure that power was held in the hands of the wealthy few, and it had divided France into 3 estates, the clergy, the nobility and the rest of the population. And the first 2 estates made up 3% of the population, They didn't pay much tax and they held all of the power, and the third estate had been bled dry by this system, especially in recent years due to extra taxes funding the American Revolution, and footing the bill for all the lavish opulence which the nobility enjoyed in Versailles. The Age of Enlightenment had made them very disenfranchised with their place in the world. Why does the church get to do this, and why does the nobility have all of these rights? They'd had enough, and the king was forced to gather the general estates, a form of parliament in which all three states were represented to advise him in an attempt to resolve the situation. But after too many disagreements, the third estate left this agreement and formed the National Assembly their own government, as well as a constitution and a declaration of the rights of man. There were anti-monarchy riots in Paris and the Bastille was stormed, which is one of the most famous events in French history. Also in 1789 feudalism was abolished, and later King Louis would attempt to flee but was captured. The revolutionary factions split into many sub-factions which fought one another, some pushing for the deposition of the king, and from all of this chaos the First French Republic was formed in 1792. King Louis XVI was guillotined for high treason, and when the Jacobin radicals seized power, a period known as the Terror began, during which the Committee of Public Safety led by Maximilien Robespierre imposed a reign of terror on France.
Oh, I wouldn't say free, more like under new management.
They attempted to remove Christianity, but eventually Robespierre was executed during a counter-revolution. Yeah, so the French Revolution was just an absolute mess. And in the background of all of this, France was however having a lot of military victories during the wars against the coalition of nations which had formed to restore the old order in France, in order to protect their own monarchies. Victories in Egypt and Europe were largely attributed to the young French general who distinguished himself during the Revolutionary Wars. He's the namesake of this period, which will go on to be known as the Napoleonic Wars. And history does frustrate me sometimes, because you can say that it really is the study of the history of the aristocracy, and since lots of this video has just been me talking about power passing between kings, but now introducing Napoleon Bonaparte. He is a very low noble from the backwater island of Corsica with no prospects, who'd been sent to military school in France, emerging as an artillery officer. Napoleon would make his name during the recapture of Toulon from the British, before leading successful campaigns in Italy and Egypt. Eventually staging a coup d'etat, Napoleon had found himself first consul of France. And despite the ideals of the revolution, you could say that the absolute rule of the Bourbon kings had merely been replaced with Napoleon's military dictatorship. After 5 years he was crowned Emperor of France, but didn't really have a moment's peace during this time, constantly at war with the coalitions which formed against him, as the European monarchies attempted to put down this French Republic before their own subjects got any ideas. But being a master tactician, Napoleon and his Grand Army managed to carve an empire through Europe, where he appointed his family members as kings of the continent, and with the victory at the Battle of Austerlitz he won dominance of Europe. But the British Empire and her powerful navy remained the biggest threat to Napoleonic France, and after the destruction of the French fleet at Trafalgar, along with any hopes of invasion of the island, France enforced trade embargoes on Britain via the continental system, banning trade with Britain, but the Tsars of Russia refused, and in 1812 Napoleon invaded the Great Bear of Europe. In June, this was a disaster, and with supply lines extremely vulnerable across the vast distances from Europe to Moscow, in combination with the brutal Russian winter and constant harassment by Cossacks, Napoleon lost 500,000 men in this campaign. Despite winning the Battle of Borodino and burning Moscow to the ground, the Emperor trudged his way back to Europe, his power shattered. Seeing Napoleon defeated, the European powers formed yet another coalition and defeated the Emperor at the Battle of Leipzig. And Louis XVIII was crowned king of a restored monarchy, and Napoleon was exiled to Elba, before returning to France a year later. He overthrew the monarchy, seized power, raised an army. But yet another coalition intercepted Napoleon's army on the way to Brussels, at Waterloo. Here, at one of history's most famous battles, Napoleon was defeated by the British and Prussians. He abdicated again and was exiled to an even worse island, this time St. Helena, where he would live out his days. It had taken 7 European coalitions to defeat the Corsican general's regime. Louis XVIII of the House of Bourbon was restored yet again, and at the 1815 Congress of Vienna, France's pre-revolution borders were restored. 15 years later, Charles X was overthrown in the July Revolution after his tyranny, and replaced by Louis Philippe, his cousin, who pushed for the invasion of Algeria, and later the rest of West Africa. And in 1848, as part of a trend across Europe, there was yet another revolution. The king was forced to abdicate, and France became a republic for the second time. Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected the nation's first president, but upon being forced to step down at the end of his term, He pulled a Caesar and had himself elected president for life in a most likely rigged election, and Napoleon III would go on to reinstate the French Empire. But this was a disaster. He didn't have his uncle's skills, and culminated in defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. The empire collapsed again, and France became a republic. Again, and Germany, which had fallen from Prussia after its defeat of France, was now the biggest power on the continent, threatening the balance which had existed for centuries. But despite this defeat, a period known as La Belle Époque followed, a peaceful time in France where art flourished, famously with the construction of the Eiffel Tower and the invention of cinema. The Third Republic established territories in French Indochina, French Madagascar and French Polynesia, which made it the second largest empire in the world behind Britain. And despite their long rivalry, France would ally with Britain and Russia in the Triple Entente in order to maintain the balance of power against a growing Germany. And I'm going to cite my previous video for what happened next. So basically, an Austro-Hungarian was killed by a Serb in Bosnia, causing Austria and Germany to declare war on Serbia. Russia defends Serbia, so Austria and Germany declare war on Russia and its ally France, and attack France through Belgium. This causes Great Britain to get involved to help Belgium. So Germany attempted to quickly defeat France, getting close to Paris before the Western Front devolved into grinding trench warfare. And although the French uniforms went so incredibly hard, they were outdated for the modern industrial war. But the Allies slowly pushed back the Germans, culminating in the Armistice of 1918. This left over 1 million French dead in the famous battles of the Marne and Verdun, but restored the territories lost during the Franco-Prussian Wars. But with the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was unfairly subjected to brutal terms following the war. It was forced to state that it had been completely responsible for the fighting, which was just a lie, and pay the crippling amount of war reparations demanded by the Allies. To be fair, the war had left 3 million French dead, so they did push for revenge in the Treaty of Versailles. But in the years that followed, resentment of the humiliation caused a rise of the evil Nazi regime in Germany. And in 1939, France and the Allies declared war in the expansionist German Reich. Following a phony war in which no one really wanted to fight, France was invaded in 1940, as the German army completely bypassed the strongly fortified French Maginot Line. And Paris soon fell to the Blitzkrieg. Most of France was occupied for the following 4 years, and President Charles de Gaulle served as head of the government in exile from the safety of London. And meanwhile, the German puppet government of Vichy France controlled the southern France, his colonial possessions.
I don't know. I never counted. I am not really a math guy, you know.
Resistance continued, and following the invasion in 1944, Paris and France were liberated from the Nazis, following Operation Overlord and Operation Dragoon. And with that, the Fourth Republic was formed, but the French Empire began to crumble, with territories demanding independence. France did make more of an effort to hold on to them than the British Empire did, but soon only a few overseas territories remained. The war for Algerian independence in 1954 made the Fourth Republic collapse, and this led to the return of Charles de Gaulle as president, forming the constitution of the Fifth Republic in 1958. And this is the state that France is today. And I'm not going to talk too much about the modern day, but although from an outside perspective France seems like a bit of a war zone at the moment, it is one of the world's most powerful countries. It's a member of the UNSC and nuclear power. It's one of the richest and most beautiful countries in the world, and the most visited holiday destination in the world. But they are pretty rude, so in conclusion I hate France. Thanks for watching.
That's a nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is...